And you know, IEDs are one major part of how we fight wars now, or what we ask our young people to do when they fight wars, face IEDs. Why are there IEDs? Which are extremely cheap. You know, you can make them for a few $1,000s. You take an artillery shell, you take your phone, you know the phone when you walk around your house, not a mobile phone, I guess it's called. You strap that to the artillery device, you have the base of the phone and press the button, the buzzer, blow it up. They're easy, very easy to make, or garage door, remote control, whatever. Those IEDs are the heart of asymmetric warfare. And it is the way that people who don't have armies cannot face the United States, which has the most effective, most expensive army in the world, because of course we support a defense establishment that is bigger, depending on how you figure it, than the rest of the world combined. And the consequence of this is that there's no army out there that can fight the United States. So they fight with improvised explosive devices, which are extraordinarily effective and mean that you have these absolutely horrible, absolutely astonishing wounds where people lose limbs and have incredible head wounds in particular, and come back with mental trauma as a part of the concussions from these explosives. And this is the character of the kind of wars we're fighting both in Afghanistan and Iraq, certainly. If we get on the ground, it'll be the kind of war we're fighting certainly in Libya as well. And it's to get back to one of the points Peter was making. The design of this kind of warfare is not only to kill people in vehicles, in patrols, like my friend the IED magnet, it is to cause them to react to these attacks by shooting at houses or people nearby. In other words, this is a strategy of provocation. Can you attack these soldiers and cause them to kill civilians? Because if you cause them to kill civilians, a great many of those people's family members will join the resistance. Can you cause them to do what Peter said, which is when an IED goes off, after the vehicle is cleared away and the dead or medevaced out, and the wounded as well, cause them to throw a cordon around a neighborhood, search every house, and take every young man who's between the ages of 13 and 50 and throw them in Abu Ghraib or Bagram or the equivalent as suspected insurgents. Those family members, indeed, the brothers, the sons of those people, will join the resistance. So it's a kind of warfare that is aimed at provoking U.S. military troops, soldiers, Marines, and so on, to commit atrocities and to do stupid things. It's interesting that it began, of course, this phase of the house of war. You know, the Muslim world, they have two phrases, house of peace, which is also house of Islam, of course, because Islam means peace, and that is the world of Islam, Islamic world, and house of war. And house of war is everywhere else, pre-Islamic world, if you want to put it that way. And I think of that phrase a lot, the house of war, because we have essentially become the house of war. But that initial attack on September 11th, the 10-year anniversary of which we will be observing in a couple of months, that was also an act in its essence of provocation. It killed nearly 3,000 people, of course, those attacks, but there was a particular design behind it. One key part of it was to provoke the United States into occupying Afghanistan. That is, occupying it the way the Soviet Union had 20 years before. And the consequence would have been, in the mind of Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, to destroy the United States, create a quagmire and destroy the United States as this thinking went. The Soviet Union was destroyed before it, destroy the second superpower. That was the first idea. And of course, the US partly responded not by occupying immediately Afghanistan, but by mostly attacking it from the air, using troops on the ground who were Northern Alliance, who were actually Afghans and enemies of the Taliban. And it's also the reason why a couple of days before the attack on the United States, 3 days before, Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was the main Afghan opposition leader, was murdered, assassinated in Afghanistan. They sent in a couple of people posing as journalists who had a video camera full of plastic explosives and killed him because they knew the United States would invade and use these opposition troops against them. So this was absolutely understood, that provocation. And also, as Peter and I were discussing during the drive up here yesterday, the second point, and it's a remarkable one and ironic and idealistic, was, and you can read this in the writings of the late Osama bin Laden, the second idea was to provoke the US population, Americans, into engaging in a discussion about US policy in the Middle East. The thought was, we're going to show Americans that they have a deeply immoral policy. They're backing the autocracy in Cairo, the Mubarak regime, to the tune of $2 billion a year. They're backing the Saudis, the regime in Riyadh, as their main military supporter. These are these two autocracies we desperately want to supplant. We will attack the Americans, and they will engage in this discussion with their leaders, and they will force their leaders to stop this immoral policy in the Middle East. Needless to say, the second provocation didn't have a fruitful outcome. There was no discussion about American policy in the Middle East. In fact, it's partly for that reason I would suggest that the Bush administration took, and George W. Bush in particular as the main spokesman, took the argument from the beginning that why did they attack us? They hate our freedoms. They hate our freedoms. This has nothing to do with policy. It has nothing to do with what role the U.S. plays in the world. It has nothing to do with anything that the U.S. does. It has to do with who Americans are. They hate American freedom. Osama bin Laden eventually, in a statement he put out just before the 2004 elections, ridiculed this idea. He said, why does George W. Bush say, we hate your freedoms, we hate your freedoms? If we hated your freedoms, why wouldn't we attack Sweden, he said. This was a joke, like most of Osama bin Laden's jokes, that didn't get around very much, I'm afraid. Just one last point here, which is Barack Obama came into office, and he did something I think that was very brave and very interesting, and it's the side of Barack Obama that I love, cherish, and that inspired me, which is that side of him that does this incredibly daring, horrible, and outlandish thing. He talks to us occasionally like we're adults. It's shocking, and when it happens, it's always shocking. The race speech, remember that? My God, he's talking to us like we're adults. Who's he talking to? Couldn't be Americans. But he went to Cairo, as he said he would do, and remember he grew up partly in Indonesia, so he was familiar as a young man with the Islamic world. In fact, his memoir is fascinating, Dreams of My Father, about his time in Indonesia as a young boy. But he went to Cairo and he gave this remarkable speech in which he quoted from the Quran. He supported democracy. He described a world very much like the one that we are now in. Well, that's perhaps too strong a statement, but he described...
You mean the Arab Spring?
Exactly. The Arab Spring, of course, which we can talk about, is a very complicated springtime. But, and in fact, our planes are taking part in it by bombing Libyans. So it's a very complicated Arab Spring. But in fact, it was a kind of harbinger, this speech, and I'd encourage you, if you didn't see it, to look at it. It really is sort of the American president at his best. But I bring it up because it also brought up these remarkable contradictions in which you thought, well, yes, he's giving this in Cairo to this very appreciative audience. And in fact, it's under the shadow of this regime that we pay $2 billion a year that couldn't stay in power without American support, and that is a terrible autocracy. and that terrible, tortures, in fact, tortured some prisoners for us during the War on Terror, among other Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, who was the guy who told Colin Powell that the Iraqis were training al-Qaeda terrorists. This is what he told the UN. That man was tortured and gave him, and it was completely false. The Egyptians did the torturing at our behest. And here is a regime, a terrible autocracy that the US supported 100%, along with the Saudis, for realpolitik reasons, and that Obama, as president, was powerless. You think of a president, he can come in, he can do this, he can do that, but if you look at this policy that's been consensus American policy against for administrations of both parties for 40 years, and the policy with respect to the Saudis, which has been consensus American policy across administrations of both parties since 1944, since FDR met with King Ibn Saud aboard an American cruiser in the Great Bitter Lake, a famous meeting in which the king brought aboard the ship a whole flock of lambs because he didn't trust American food. And the US gave him a Rolls Royce, I think. So these policies go back a very long way, and they have to do with the American imperial role in the Middle East, which it inherited from the British, and which a single president is, in a sense, almost powerless to change. And it was these policies, if we would have had the discussion that Osama bin Laden, in his strange, evil innocence, had thought he might provoke by attacking the United States, it's these policies that we might have discussed. And we might have said, if we were discussing them, well, what are these people after? They don't hate our freedoms. They want to unseat these autocratic governments that, in the case of Ayman al-Zawahiri, have tortured them in Egypt. Now, they don't want to replace them with democracies, on the contrary, but they want to replace them with governments that they think will be Islamic and justified, as opposed to autocracies that the United States supports that are brutal and that the people don't support. So you had governments that supported the United States and people that didn't, which is one of the reasons, as we sit here watching the Arab Spring take hold, even as the US continues with its troops in the 3 countries I mentioned, one of the reasons that, as they say in Washington, things may go better for the people, but less well for US policy. It's a very strange position for us to be in, just to bring it back to idealism, democracy, and rule of the people, which is where we started.